It's time to jump into the October reading wrap-up. 2-star reads. Halloween Fiend by C.V. Hunt. There's a ton that's very charming about this particular story, and I think generally speaking most audiences will really enjoy Halloween Fiend. There's just something in it for me that didn't gel, and I think it has to do more with C.V. Hunt's tendency to write like such incredibly unlikable, unpalatable characters. It turns out that this is the second book from C.V. Hunt I've read, and I don't think I'm going to pick up any more of these unlikable characters. I feel like I know, and I already know what they're going to do and how they're going to respond, and it's all just something I don't want to deal with. Next is going to be An Omega for the Lycan Prince by Isa Runner. This is a werewolf shifter romance, but if you look at the cover, it looks like it's going to have like some horror, scary kind of elements in it, and the summary itself sort of implies that there might be. The Omega character is used to being bottom of the totem pole, like feels very lucky that she's treated well instead of expecting that as her due, and she's getting paired up with this like super royal, super in charge boss man alpha, so it feels like the relationship might be problematic, or like there might be some elements of it that are scary to her. Has like that beastly controlling yourself element that you might see in like a werewolf horror side of things, and I was skeptical of this outcome pretty early into the story, maybe like the first 30 pages. I was like,
Yeah, this cover is just misleading.
as a whole, the work does some interesting things that I haven't seen often in werewolf fiction literature. The werewolf and the human are two entirely separate beings, and they have their own names and thoughts and feelings and personalities. Our main character's name is one thing, and her werewolf is called something else. And she can't always talk to that werewolf or connect to it or understand what's going on with it. For a good portion of it, I wasn't sure if the werewolf situation was spiritual or if they actually transformed. That's like how in the dark I was about some parts of it. So in that way, it was like pretty interesting read. And I could see this potentially as being an interesting way for like someone with just one mind inhabiting one body, considering like more than one mind inhabiting the same body, as we see in some dissociative disorders. And in particular, I like this as a vehicle for that because it happens without the trauma element. And I think unpacking those two separate parts of that disorder separately is like a good way to go, because there's like what caused it and dealing with that and all the elements of that that might be happening, and then there's just like the day-to-day life, which doesn't have to be traumatic or sad or scary or bad in any way, shape, or form. So even though there's like all these really interesting elements that I think could be fun outlets and fun explorations and new steps into the werewolf genre, at the end of the day there's a ton of exposition in this, a lot of telling and explaining and backstory. The relationship between this college girl and this slightly older guy like is just not very romantic or compelling to me. Like I didn't feel any chemistry. And even though they go through a ton of things, and props to this book for going through an arc that most novels would have broken up into its own like 3-book series, it's all like really stereotypical stuff, like, oh, let's get through college, lifestyle living, oh, there's a pack acting out and my alpha has to take that pack over. Like all of these things you see all the time. They're like so by the numbers, common tropey elements. There's a real chosen one vibe going on with this Omega that really turned me off to the overall story. I'd like to see more werewolf books that have like this complete separation between the human and the wolf, but I think that's the only thing I'd want to take forward from the book. Like the rest of it is kind of like garbage. 3 stars. To Her Rescue by Drea Anderson. This is a black love, panther shifter, contemporary fantasy, paranormal romance story. This girl's grandfather has passed and left all of his riches to her in the will on the condition she be married when she receives all of his money and wealth and stuff, which has her controlling family trying to like push her into an arranged marriage so they can like steal the money from her. And her love protagonist like agrees to do the marriage, and he's doing it specifically because he like has a crush and the two of them have chemistry from previous situations together, but also also because he wants to protect her from like her overbearing and mean family. I think all of these elements work well together. I liked the panther shifter instead of the werewolf. I thought we got like some unique cat-like elements to our characters that were enjoyable, and like a big cat versus like a wolf is like a nice mix up every now and then. I liked the characterization of our female lead protagonist, and I liked for the most part the romance and level of steam we were getting between her and our lead. All that was gelling well for me. It's sitting here at 3 stars because there were some specific dynamic elements between her and the love interest that I really didn't like. They'd have a conflict and he would come in and be like,
well, that's just the way I am, and you need to deal with it.
or
I don't know why you're all worked up about this. I already told you I'm only about you.
not even how he handled it, but like the exact lines that were said just really set me off. And it's a me issue, it's not a this book issue. I think if you're looking for something that's got like that man with that protective streak, but also lets the love interest have her own individuality and do what she wants to do, how she wants to do it, this kind of book might be the right thing for you. Hold by Claire Kent. This book's unremarkable, but it's not bad. It's another installment into the science fiction terrible prison planet genre. And I think the construction of the prison was interesting, the way that they built the government and how that was working and how outsiders were responding to these kind of like lifelong prison sentences, prisoners just run the planet kind of thing, all worked fine. And I think like the level of brutality and deviance we see in the prison is like at a manageable level. Like sometimes these books go too hard and they're really rough to read. This one like walks the line between being like realistically dark, but not so dark and grim that like the romance happening it feels out of place or out of balance. As a whole, I kind of find these books rough reads because our modern American prison system is really in a bad place. And while it's nowhere near the level like a whole planet where we just leave people for shoplifting there for the rest of their lives along with murderers and other people, it's not great. And I can see very easily how humanity could evolve into these like really corrupt prison systems and for-profit industries, and it makes me feel a little bit sad about life in general. In this specific story, I didn't find the male love interest relatable at all. I just don't like the strong silent type kind of guy. If he isn't giving me enough communication, I don't care about him. And I don't understand why the girly boo is with him. I mean, obviously in this prison situation, she's with him because her options are remain with him or fend for herself, which she's incapable of doing in the scenario set up. I think most people who are into like the prison romance style scenario will like this one. I think it does a good job of walking that line between like too dark and too silly. Next is going to be Bloodline by Jess Lowry. I picked this up because it was on Goodreads, like 100 scary stories to read in October. I don't know that I would consider this a horror story. It's definitely more thriller suspense, and it does very well in thriller suspense, I think. And as far as Kindle Unlimited goes, I think the writing in this is really above and beyond what you normally see. And there's like a bunch of fun elements in it. I felt a little bit like I was listening to a story from my mom or my grandma where they're like calling out specific outfits they were wearing and specific recipes and how the TVs were different and all that kind of stuff, because it is like a period suspense thriller. But like all of these like conspiracy thriller suspense elements, there were parts that like strain suspension of disbelief. Overall, I'm not sure how invested I am in this style of storytelling. I would have also preferred it if the story had been told straight linearly instead of starting us off knowing that whatever this character is experiencing is true and she's really in danger, because I like that waffling back and forth about whether or not the narrator is reliable. So knowing that she is definitely reliable and right now she's like imprisoned and all this stuff is leading up to her imprisonment is just like not as investing to me. I think they had to do it in this case because the start of this novel is so incredibly slow. I'm not confident anyone would keep reading it if they didn't already know that she's like locked up at the end and desperately needs to escape. To me, that's a problem with the story. And the solution is not telling it non-linearly so we don't get the waffling of whether the narrators are reliable or not. It's like,
Punch up the beginning of this story a little bit, bro.
I get why people are into Bloodline, I just don't think it's the right thing for me. 4 stars. Camp Slaughter by Sergio Gomez. I was talking a little bit about this back in my September reading wrap up where I was comparing it with Camp Blaze. This is a great, like, summer haunted, spooky, forest in the woods kind of read. And I liked it so much, I have picked up the sequel, which is Halloween Slaughter, and I'm about a third of the way through right now. You'll probably get that review in November. But if you're interested at all in this series, I would go ahead, pick up the first book, and then into the second book because the third book's coming out, I think, in January of next year. Our killer is like such an interesting, fascinating kind of read. The premise of Camp Slaughter is that there's this very isolated cabin in Pennsylvania that people keep going missing from. In fact, like the whole surrounding area, campers seem to go missing from that area. And there's a paranormal investigator YouTube crew that's coming down to look at it. There's a bunch of kids that are just renting out this cabin to have a fun party. And then there's like the perspective of the killer slash cannibal person who's doing all these things. Sergio Gomez weaves a lot of complex, interesting elements together because there's our killer who's very interesting. He's got like a damaged childhood backstory. He's got like a mentally ill, neurodiverse component. And he also has this component of like legitimate, spooky, otherworldly, like ghosts or spirits kind of thing going on. I liked all of the characters. I thought they were very well rounded, compelling, made sense. I thought that Sergio Gomez did a lot of showing instead of telling. I think the book took its time in a way that made the pacing like just spot on perfect. I think the scares and the gore were necessary for the story was being told. It never got to a point where it felt like gratuitous or something that was happening just for shock value. All of it like kind of made sense and gelled and was like,
Yeah, in this situation, that's what this killer would do.
where a lot of times, like in Camp Blaze, some of the earlier kills, I didn't understand why they were so gory once we got the explanation for why the killers were killing. So if you're looking for like that extreme horror, you're looking for your next like scary cannibal read, you're looking for that stereotypical slasher story, but like told in a more elevated, engaging manner, I think Sergio Gomez is your guy. I loved Camp Slaughter and I'm really enjoying my trek through Halloween Slaughter, and I'm excited for the third one to come out. Right now, it's definitely on my TBR. Next is The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. This story is worth less and less stars the farther I get from the ending, but I think it's an amazing beach read. It's highly palatable, it's really easy to read, it has good pacing and an enjoyable protagonist. I think all the side characters are really fun and engaging. I think it's just like that little bit silly that you need in a final last girl slasher style story. There's nothing like scary about it. It doesn't quite hold the horror unless you're talking about existential horror of why there's always a final last girl and what it is about society that we single women out in this way, both for violence and for praise when they survive that violence. I really liked the style of writing though. I liked the pacing. This is one of those few books where I didn't mind that it was being told a little bit out of time. Like the parts that we really want to hear about are the original thing that made these girls the final last girl, and we keep holding that reveal back from readers. You have to keep pushing forward, and often you even have to read like the little asides that are before chapters to figure out how these girls came to be final last girls, and even then there's like some implication and inference and not like a full out story told for you. I think like putting these women's trauma, which is the part that like the reader wants and society as a whole wants, here on the margins in like an epigraph that you may or may not choose to read, instead of front and center making that the entertainment, is part of the statement and is a very interesting way to go about it. Certainly there's a larger issue going on right now because the final last girls are getting killed off. There's also a question about unreliable narrator going on because we're following the most paranoid and delusional of the final last girls. So it makes sense when her fellow support girls don't necessarily believe her, and there's a couple other alienating factors that play in there. I loved some of like the cult-like depictions of people like with these shrines to death, and like how some people like empathize with the killers more than they do the survivors. And I like how this story story can talk about both like our fascination with true crime right now, but also with like our fascination in the past with these final last girls. Like it's applicable both to this fictional craze of the past, but also like the modern incarnation of it now is not any better. And it's a discussion opener for those kind of things for people who might not usually be open to these kind of narratives or this kind of deconstruction of what makes media interesting and why it takes off. Next is Transmuted by Eve Harms. I'd put this into like a horror comedy style story. The basic premise is that there is a trans woman who wants facial feminization surgery, and to get it she did some crowdfunding. Unfortunately, it's revealed that her father is very ill with cancer, time is essential, and he needs the money that she crowdfunded to do a last-ditch survival treatment. To her credit, she does give him the money so he can do that, but it leaves her in this bind because that money was crowdfunded. People are expecting results from her facial feminization surgery. Of course, she also mentally just really needed that surgery as well. So she ends up going to see like this less than reputable doctor who's got like an alternative experimental surgery that will give her the same result she was looking for. I really liked the transformative elements in this story. Obviously, it's a horror story, so the transformation doesn't go 100% as she planned, but I loved the stages of transformation she underwent. I loved her dealing with them. I think this story does a great job balancing traits in our main character, because on one side, the situation she's in is really difficult, and I feel empathetic and sympathetic and want to support and help her in that struggle. And on the other side, she has a whole ton of like incredibly insufferable traits of like being terminally online and obsessed with social media and always worried about what other people think and feel. And like some of that I understand is her gender dysphoria and her not feeling like she is being seen and perceived in the way that she feels internally. And some of that feels like an obsession with looks and clout chasing and trending and like the selfie culture that I find just incredibly annoying and frustrating. Part of me is like,
You're in this own cycle a little bit self-made, like, oh, what are they all saying on Instagram? How are people responding to things? And you're like terminally online, you need to go out there and touch some grass.
and some of it is not that. And like balancing that wire of being frustrated and annoyed with her and wanting to shake her and like also wanting to give her a hug and wanting to validate her is like a very unique and great feeling. And it happens throughout the entirety of her transformation and her story. There are so many parts where she's like so focused on her looks and on what this means for her going out in society or streaming or whatever. And I wanted to,
Girl, we're way beyond that point right now.
it's very fast paced. It only took me a day to get through it because it's a pretty short novella. It's a huge recommendation if you like body horror, horror comedy, that kind of story. And also I think a story like this is going to be very time capsule-y in our pop culture zeitgeist. And in a few years we're going to look back on this and be like,
Oh, that has all the hallmarks of that time and place.
it's gonna be fun to be part of that. Next is gonna be Benny Rose, The Cannibal King by Haley Piper. This is just a super fun Halloween slasher style story. I love that it takes place in Halloween. I love the isolated town. I love that they have their own little like urban legend thing going on, and then we're exploring the many facets of that urban legend. The three girls that we follow throughout this story are great. I'm really rooting for them. They all have their own like individual flaws and arcs, and I think that's part of what makes them just perfect for the role they're playing. Benny Rose as a Cannibal King is also like a great horror character. Being afraid this dude's gonna eat you, the fact that he like may or may not be a ghost, may or may not be immortal, so fun to go through with them. I don't know that I find a lot of horror or tension in these slasher style films. The purpose is for everyone to be killed off and for everyone to be a little bit awful, but there's real heart and a message in this story that sort of shines through regardless. And I think there's just something so authentic in it that it's hard not to like it. 5 stars. Hollow Beasts by Elisa Lynn Valdez. I love this story. I can't wait for the second one to come out. Got it on my TBR. I'm really excited for it. In a lot of ways, it was like your classic cop, thriller, mystery, detective style story. We're following Jody, who's returning to her home in New Mexico and starting a new career path as a game warden. She's taking over for her uncle. Game wardens usually work alone over large stretches of wilderness. So there's this real sense of isolation, threat, danger. And Jody is like an incredibly intelligent and competent woman who has like a lot of what I would consider righteous or justified anger. And of course, she's trying to work through all of this while living her day-to-day life and being a great mom to her daughter and a good sister to her brother. And while all that's happening in the woods, there's like this extremist group camping out that's like holding different women hostage and hunting them and killing them in the woods. And we come to find out it's not just that, but they're also planning a terrorist attack on a nearby town. And she has to sort of like slowly uncover this plot, figure out who the key players are, figure out how to deal with this situation when even other people in the system are trying to like thwart her. So well told, so interesting, so much fun, a great sense of pacing and tension. I think Elisa Lynn Valdez is an excellent author. There's this beautiful like poetry and symmetry in the writing. She tells the story from multiple perspectives, and I think each character she embodies so well and has such a distinct, unique voice. It's really enjoyable. This is like a suspense action thriller done like to perfection, and I can't recommend it enough. Manhunt by Gretchen Felker Martin. I had thought I was going to try to do a reading vlog of this, but I ended up reading it while I was on vacation with my family, and that just wasn't going to work out because I'm super sensitive about doing anything creative when other people are looking at me. And I kind of ended up doing all the vlogging content, talking with my husband on our morning walks anyways, so I don't know that like you'd have got anything from me sitting in front of a camera. But this story is really excellent. I love that gender war, dystopia kind of story. Manhunt has such a unique and full take on it. There's a lot of like this great imagery of men becoming these zombie monsters and doing this violence against women. And there's these parallels between like the zombie monsters and like what was happening in the real world previously before men had become these monsters. There's all this violence and anger and rage like within the survivor women themselves. Some of them have broken off into these extremist turf groups. Some of them are living like in their sheltered privileged bunkers. All these little individual stories and plopped down in like all these little segments and fragments and shattered remains of society are our two trans women protagonists who are trying to keep their humanity and also keep their gender identity at the same time and maintain a low enough T count that they don't become these zombie monsters themselves. The body horror and the level of gruesomeness in this book cannot be understated. I expected a lot of that going in because we're talking about zombies and we're talking about transition, which involves surgeries and stuff, and surgery just in general squicks me out. And we're even talking about like biological women going through menopause and becoming low enough in estrogen that they might also zombify. And then we're also talking about like male children who haven't hit puberty, so they don't have the T count that they need to zombify. But like, what do we do to keep them from being zombies? And all of that's kind of like horrific and bad. But there's also like all kinds of stuff about like our characters having injuries and having to like sew them up that was gory and intense. And specifically when I knew this was going to be a rough read was in the first 20 pages where Fran gets hurt and she breaks a tooth and they have to fix that. Oh, I'm so sensitive to anything dentistry, tooth related. That was so rough. I read that scene and then I just put the book down for like a good couple hours because I couldn't go any further. Who says that books can't make you feel things just as intensely as watching it on screen, huh? And Manhunt doesn't let us off the hook. It is gripping and thrilling the whole way through, and the ending is not a happily ever after. Grim and ambiguous and uncertain all the way to the end. And I really respected that it had one single tone, one thought or voice, and it just maintained that no matter how grueling it might be for the reader. I think my overall enjoyment on this book is closer to 4 than 5. The prose themselves are just a little too terse for me, and I think it fits with the descriptions and what's happening in the world around it, but I just like something that's a little bit flowier in general. I think what really brought this into 5 stars for me though was the way things end and how it maintains that bleakness and stares dead at the reader and the camera the whole time, forcing you to look it in the eye. There are a million little like subplots and little things you could pick apart in this book, and quite a few people have. In fact, the person who alerted me to this book existing was going to be a video Jessie Gender did over a year ago that I'm going to link in the comments above. She has a great critique of Manhunt, and she does a more in-depth deep dive. But just know, if you like post-apocalyptic, dystopia kind of stories, this one definitely deserves a place in your top 10 post-apocalyptic, world-ending event stories. And that's going to be everything I read here in October. It was very horror-centric. Talk to me in those comments down below. What was your favorite read this past October? And as always, keep reading. Bye!